Good morning. I'm talking today about Good Friday, the cross factor. And I'd like to invite you this Good Friday to join with me on a kind of a whistle-stop tour of a day before Passover 2,000 years ago. And it's just 2 chapters of John's Gospel which cover the last day of Jesus' life before he faced the cross on the hill, and before the world will be changed forever, never to be the same again. So I'm going to start really with the Last Supper and then into the Garden of Gethsemane. For practical reasons, we've decided that we're going to break this message into 3 sections. And this first section is dealing with the Last Supper in the garden. Now, that first Good Friday, you'll remember that the Last Supper had actually happened on the Thursday night, when Jesus had shown the meaning of how true greatness lies in truly humble service, when he'd washed the feet of the disciples, showing that to be great you must become the lowly, suffering servant. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and to return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he'd come from God, and that he would be returning to God. So he got up from the table and he took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and he poured water into a basin. And then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that he had around him. He was an example to be followed. Sometimes we're there simply to serve, simply to love. We do this as we have the example to follow, in humility, reflecting to others the love that's shown to us. Jesus said, as you do it to the least of them, so you do it for me. He embodies the suffering servant, and he shows us that to be great, you must first be humble. And then in John 14 onwards, Jesus comes across as talking rapidly. He had so little time and so much to say. He actually is quoted as saying, I don't have much more time to talk to you, because the ruler of this world approaches. He has no power over me, but I will do what the Father requires of me. And then Jesus goes on to say, there's so much more I want to tell you. We get a sense of urgency now. Everything is rapidly coming together. Time is fast running out. And after this, including after Judas had had his own feet washed and he'd taken the bread from Jesus, we're told that Satan entered him and he left the table to betray Jesus to the religious leaders. So now we're going to jump to the Garden of Gethsemane, John chapter 18, verses 4 to 10, and I've taken it from the New International Version. It says this, it says, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and he crossed into the Kidron Valley. And on the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who had betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples, and so Judas comes to the garden guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they're all carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. And Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. And when Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and they fell to the ground. And again he asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, let these other men go. And this happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled in the prophets, where it says, I have not lost one of those you gave me. How powerful, isn't it, that these religious leaders, they'd come armed by night to arrest Jesus. And yet when he says, I am he, they fall to the ground. Because by saying that, he is echoing the name of God, I am. Another confirmation of his divinity, and they responded accordingly by falling to the ground. He was now allowing to happen what he had only just prayed a few minutes before. Not my will, but thine be done. And then, so now John 18, 12 to 15, it goes on. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and they brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Now let's not forget that Jesus had told Nicodemus, as recorded for us in John 3, that as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up just the same. And Nicodemus would later be the one that brought 100 pounds of embalming spices to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body for burial. So Jesus is bound and dragged before Annas, the high priest Caiaphas, his father-in-law. And it was Caiaphas who'd earlier suggested that maybe it would be better that one man should die, that the people would be saved. Well, there's a lot of prophetic irony there, but not at the level of Caiaphas's kind of practical, nationalistic sense of survival in the relationship between Israel and the Roman overlords. He didn't want trouble with Rome, but Jesus Christ of Nazareth was going to be lifted up as the perfect Passover lamb, so that all who believe can be saved from an eternal spiritual death. Annas asks Jesus about his doctrine and was very bluntly shut down by Jesus, whose reply was that he had always been very public in everything that he did, very open in everything that he said, and it was in plain sight and in hearing of the Jewish leaders. So, therefore, if Annas wants answers, why not ask the witnesses? John 18, verses 19 to 21. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? All those who heard me, surely they know what I said. So Jesus is sent before the high priest, and in between the two encounters with Annas and Caiaphas, we learn something else. Because you remember in the Last Supper, Jesus had told Peter that he would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed at daybreak. Well, now we're told that this has indeed happened. And I've got a thought, which is, how often do we deny Jesus in our daily lives? If when I'm in work, for example, my frustration or my exasperation cause me to swear with foul words, I'm denying Jesus. If we give in to old habits of substance abuse, Jesus looks on sadly, and he's saying, I've already freed you from that. If we look at another person with a lustful eye, we know that we're letting Jesus down through the ways of the flesh. If we express anger at the shortcomings of others, are we still showing love? I would suggest that we're denying Jesus in our lives when we should be bearing witness to Jesus for the sake of the others around us. We all of us, daily deny Jesus in our thoughts and our words and our deeds. So we're now going to take a break and we're going to have a song. Thank you. A sing song. Okay, so we now come to part 2 of the Good Friday sermon. And this is where we're looking now at the interrogation and sentencing of Jesus. So Annas had sent the bound Jesus to Caiaphas. Caiaphas in turn sends him to the Praetorium to face the might of imperial Rome as represented by Pontius Pilate. This is because they want Jesus dead. But being under Roman military rule, they haven't got the authority to execute someone. Because for Roman execution, it had to be shown that Jesus had committed an offence against Caesar, such as insurrection or rebellion. But Jesus had always confounded the attempts to make him speak against Roman rule. And so here they were going to need false witnesses, people that were prepared to lie. I have to admit to feeling a small amount of sympathy with Pilate, because 3 times he tells the Jews Jesus hasn't committed any crime. John 18:38, "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. And with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there, and he said, I find no basis for a charge against him. John 19, 1-4. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged with scourges, which had like long leather strips with bits of metal embedded in the leather. So when it whipped your back, it was ripping out flesh. Some people died from that alone. But they had Jesus scourged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they clothed him in a purple robe, and they went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and slapping him in the face. And after all of that degradation and humiliation and torture and physical pain, Pilate then once more came out and said to the Jews gathered there, Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. Maybe in this way, Pilate thought they might have had some sympathy for this flogged and bleeding victim, but if so, he would be disappointed. And then again, we've got John 19:6, we have the third example. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him, because as for me, I find no basis for any charge against him. The Jews still do not have the legal authority to crucify Jesus at this point. And so they remind Pilate that Jesus was alleged to have said that he was the King of the Jews. So now we come to lies, you see. Jesus was alleged to have said that he was King of the Jews. And if that was true, that would make Jesus a threat to Caesar's authority. And so we learn in verse 12 that from this point, Pilate wanted Jesus set free. But we learn in verse 16, finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And so this brings us into the next section of this tragic account of an act of ultimate beauty and also the world's greatest miscarriage of justice. Let's have another song. Okay, so we come to part 3. And in part 3 of this Good Friday message, we're looking at the crucifixion now. And so the reading is from John 19, verses 16 to 23. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was close to the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." It's important now for us to take a look back at what had been said centuries before Jesus became flesh by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 53, verses 4 to 72. "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, and yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, although he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. And yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sins of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Isn't that incredible? Written centuries before Jesus came, and it's all about him. Now that is, so far, what we've looked at is an accurate account of horrible violence, leaving the victim unrecognizable, scarcely human. It's about suffering that is so awful that people are ashamed and they look away. Massive injustice, but also of vindication, of how suffering bears fruit. And it's about a new work of God that is springing up when all seems lost in darkness and futility. Because this is about a substitute. This is about a king who stands in for his people, who does for them what they can't do for themselves. It's about one who speaks up for the people who can't see or speak it for themselves. This is, in Judaism terms, this is the priest who enters the holy place alone on behalf of the people. This is the life of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. The minister Frank Topping expressed what happened like this: he who had no sin has looked straight into the face of sin and felt the blast of its violence, the ugly explosion of self-centeredness. Before his eyes, all of the vile and petty sins, the meanness, the spite, the gossip, and the greed, they writhe like worms in the dung of satanic beasts. On his back, the weight of the world's distress presses and presses. Every disease, every pain ever felt, every callous act in the history of mankind adds its awful weight until, once again, Jesus falls. All the years of Jesus' earthly ministry are described with scant attention to detail by the Gospels, with regard to specific dates and times. But in these last hours and minutes of Jesus' earthly lives, we zoom in. So much detail is packed into these 2 chapters of John's Gospel, hour by hour, minute by minute, right up to and including his final breath. From Peter's final denial to Jesus climbing the hill was only a brief period, but it's crowded with incidents. And at the cross, we see a sharp conflict between love and hate, because people hated so much that they put Christ to death. But God so loved the world that he gave people life. And we're told that from midday until 3 o'clock, darkness reigned the land. The sun stopped shining, and it became as night. The curtain in the temple that was 70 feet high was torn from top to bottom in two, as a symbol of the end of the old and the beginning of the new. Because from this moment on, God no longer resides in the temple, but now in the heart of every believer. And thinking of that gospel narrative for the crucifixion, I want to remind you of an echo from a psalm written by David 1,000 years before Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And I've got a thought that I want you to hold on to, which is this. When this psalm was written, crucifixion had not been invented. So we're going now to Psalm 22, verse 1. And it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22, verses 14 to 18. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax, it has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a clay pot. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death, and dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them, and they cast lots for my garments. And Psalm 22, verse 27, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nation. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people as yet unborn, he has done it. So think about that again now with the description of my heart's turned to wax, my mouth's dried up like a clay pot, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. They pierce my hands and feet, all of my bones are on display. They divide my clothes and they cast lots for my garment. Garment singular, not plural, because Jesus' robe was a one piece, and that's why they chose not to rip it up. And yet, crucifixion hadn't been invented at that point. I think those prophetic verses require no further explanation, because if we can assume, as some people do, that mankind's greatest achievement was to navigate outer space in a rocket and to plant a flag on the moon, well then, the greatest achievement of Jesus Christ of Nazareth was that through his horrible death, that he had gone to the very bottom. He's gone to the darkest, deepest place of ruin, and there he's planted a flag. And that flag says, Tetelestai, Jesus' dying breath. It means this, it is finished. It means it's completed, it's finished. It was common in the ancient Near East of that time that when a transaction of sale was done, it would be recorded with that word, Tetelestai, which means paid in full, like a receipt. In those final words of Jesus, we see the finality of that transaction. He has paid the price for us. He's paid the ransom. He's paid in full. And that's on the flag when he went to the very depths for us. It is finished. Now, those first readers or hearers of the gospel, they would have instantly recognized and understood the meaning of those dying words, because by taking on himself all of the sin of a whole planet of people since the dawn of time to the end of time, all of the turning away from God, all of the self-righteous disobedience of all the generations of mankind, past, present, and future. Jesus experienced for us the separation from the Father and the Spirit in order that we could have eternal life in paradise with him. When he cried out, "It is finished," Tetelestai, righteousness was perfected. Divine justice was satisfied. Blood was shed. Redemption was paid. Sins were forgiven. Reconciliation was achieved. Death was overcome. Salvation was secured. Somebody once said the following, "And he on whom the light shone gave light, the light of love in dark and loveless places. Love revealed him, and he revealed love, forgiving, restoring, healing, in reckless generosity, life-giving, turning upside down man-made virtues and values, parading before mankind a kingdom whose only purpose is love. He was passionate for peace and for justice, and he dazzles us with his love." When we think about that first Pentecost, the time when Jews and Christians alike now remember the time that God freed his people from slavery by sending the angel of death across the land to take the lives of all of the firstborn of the enslaving nation. Then they were saved by painting their doorposts with the blood of the sacrificial lamb. And we know as Christians that Jesus was our sacrificial lamb. He was slain to save us from death, when we proudly declare that we're washed clean by his blood on our spiritual doorposts. Jesus in his perfection endured the double death that he saved us from, because he didn't just physically die, but also for a period before his resurrection, he was also separated by our sin from unity in the Trinity of God that he had always known for the eternity before he came to earth. As Charles Spurgeon put it so beautifully, he stood before God as us, so that we can stand before God as him. He thinks we're worth it. And even in the excruciating pain hanging from the cross, Jesus' ministry continued as he comforted the man on the cross next to him with the words, "This day you'll be with me in paradise." Because Jesus is God, and God is love. His ministry to save was still in progress, not because we are in any remote sense worth saving at all, but because God loves us, and he wants us with him for eternity. Nothing, literally nothing, was too much for him to do to save us, even passing through death. And God is still saying those words today to anyone who will listen. Today you will be with me in paradise. For many of us in the present troubles, we will have experienced a wide variety of emotions. We may have unexpectedly been acting out of character. We're trying to make sense of what's happening in the world around us today, because surely isn't God meant to be in control? I mean, imagine then how confused the disciples were now after seeing Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, humiliated, brutalized, beaten in front of them, whipped, spat upon, slapped and mocked and cursed, and then killed before their eyes. In the words of the beautiful old song, "On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross, where the dearest and the best for a world of lost sinners was slain. I will cling to that old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to that old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown." You see, man's expectations were very different from God's reality. What they wanted and what they got are two very different things. Ultimate power came in love and humility, a gesture of peace to a created world that would despise him, mock him, before humiliating and killing him in the cruelest way that they knew how. But it didn't end there. And for everyone who's reading or listening to or watching this message, I hope that you get a strong sense of the meaning of Easter, because this story continues, and next weekend we're going to hear the next part of all of this factual account of what happened. And think about the personal application for you of this in your everyday life. So thank you for taking the time, and I promise you, if you decide to commit your life to the one that committed his life for you, it will be worth it. So as always, if you'd like to discuss anything in this message, our contact details will be coming up on the screen at the end of the service, and Pastor Jason will be absolutely delighted to talk to you. Bless you.